for such a wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for having me here, for the opportunity to take part in this workshop. Let me begin just by saying how much I admire what each of you do every day in your classrooms. It was my 10th grade history teacher who encouraged me and inspired me to think about history as a profession. So it's really an honor for me to have this opportunity to speak to you about teaching history, and I really look forward to our conversation about using primary sources in your classrooms. So as Jim said, we're going to spend time today talking about Chicago and the formation of urban Black communities in Chicago. I'm going to begin by discussing the Great Migration so that we can sort of get a little bit of history as to how people settled in Chicago. And then I'll move into, in the second half of my lecture, I'll move into more of a discussion of Chicago itself. So if we begin with the Great Migration, a major watershed in African American and in American history. It's this massive demographic shift that is the critical factor in the formation of urban Black communities. But of course, communities are not created simply by the presence of people in a particular place. So during the second half of my lecture, I'll talk more about how Bronzeville, the name given to the Black neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, became what some very famous sociologists would call a city within a city. And we'll talk about that. But first, let's begin with the migration. So Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Isabel Wilkerson, the author of a phenomenal work on the Great Migration, writes that the Great Migration is perhaps the biggest underrepresented story of the 20th century. Over the course of 6 decades, 6 million Black Southerners left the South in search of new lives. An estimated 500,000 left in the short 5-year span between 1916 and 1921. Over time, this mass relocation would dwarf the California gold rush of the 1850s with its 100,000 participants, and it would far outnumber the Dust Bowl migration of some 300,000 people who left Oklahoma and Arkansas and traveled to California in the 1930s. Nearly every Black family in America weighed the decision of whether to stay or to go. It was a topic that was discussed everywhere, in people's homes, in churches, on street corners. By the time the migration was over in the 1970s, few Americans had not been touched by it. The children and grandchildren of those who decided to leave the South were raised in a world that their ancestors could not have imagined. This was a mass movement, and it was a leaderless movement. In fact, ministers who urged their flocks not to leave the South would soon find themselves trailing behind their congregants who had already taken the lead and headed north. In some cases, entire churches were reconstituted in northern cities. So today, we'll discuss the contours and strategies and actors who took part in the Great Migration. And we'll explore the meanings of the Great Migration from the perspectives of the migrants themselves, focusing on their decision to leave the South and on their adjustment to life in northern cities, particularly in Chicago. It's important for us to situate the Great Migration within the larger history of the Black freedom struggle, and to recognize the Great Migration as a critical moment in the ongoing fight against Jim Crow. This was the first mass act of independence by African Americans since emancipation. So it's important for us to keep in mind the effects that the migration would have on American political and urban history. The massive political realignments of the 20th century, the movement of blacks out of the Republican Party and into the Democratic Party, which would be crucial in the presidential elections of FDR and Truman, would not have been possible without the Great Migration. The migration's imprint is everywhere in urban life. The configuration of cities, the social geography of black and white neighborhoods, the spread of housing projects, the rise of a black middle class, white flight and suburbanization, each of these phenomena grew out of the migration. And all of the major landmark political developments of the 20th century, the New Deal, industrial unionism, the Great Society, and of course the Civil Rights Movement, would be difficult to imagine without this massive demographic shift. The migration also had a profound cultural impact on American society. The migration would influence the language, food, dance, and dress that we take for granted. People around the world have been enriched by the music that the migrants carried north with them. The migration transformed American music and nationalized and popularized African American music. Three of the most influential figures in jazz, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, and John Coltrane, were all children of the migration. So since the migration had such a profound effect on American culture, I'd like for us to start with some music. And I'm going to play a song for you that was recorded by Memphis Minnie in 1934. Memphis Minnie was born in Algiers, Louisiana, and she was one of the most influential and pioneering female blues musicians and guitarists of all time. She was known for being flamboyant, for wearing bracelets made of silver dollars. And she was a migrant herself, traveling first to Memphis, Tennessee as a teenager, and later moving to Chicago in the 1930s. And please feel free to sing along. So this is Memphis Minnie, and the name of the song is Chickasaw Train Blues. And hopefully that's loud enough.
I
Campus Mini, what is her perspective on the migration? What kind of message does she give us about what the migration means to her personally?
All the men are